We're all right. We're about 5 minutes in, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to see you all here today. Um, as you, if you've been here before, you know I'm John Ruggi, and this is our latest live interview in AMA. We've been doing these about every couple of weeks now, and today we're going to talk about all things Bitcoin. So, as you know, it's just about the end of the year. We're recording this in mid-December. And it's been a really interesting year, both for Bitcoin specifically and the blockchain space in general. So to kind of help us keep tabs on what's happened and to talk about what we might expect in 2023, we thought it would be fun to do kind of a year in review on Bitcoin, which is why I'm thrilled to have Gabe Higgins here with us today. So I know a lot of you know Gabe already, but just in case you don't, Gabe has been highly engaged in the Bitcoin community since about 2012, I think. He's the co-author of a book called Thank God for Bitcoin. He leads the largest Bitcoin meetup in Florida. He's even consulted for the Secret Service, Department of Homeland Security, and I think the Florida Blockchain Task Force. And on top of all that, he's also our co-founder and chief blockchain officer at BlockSpaces. So, he and his team have been building a lot of interesting things on Lightning. Among other things as well. But in other words, if you want to talk Bitcoin, Gabe is your man. So Gabe, awesome to have you here today.
It's good to be here, John. Excited.
Yeah, me too. All right, well, before we dive in, we'll just touch base on the format today in case you are new here. The way we're going to run things is Drew and I are going to kick things off with an interview with Gabe. And about halfway through, we're going to shift gears to an AMA. So we'll open things up to field any questions you have for Gabe. So to take part in that, all you have to do is click that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. You can drop a question in there at any time. You can wait till the end if you want, but if something comes to mind while we're talking, go ahead and put that in there. And Dana is our moderator, and so she's going to keep tabs on all those questions and make sure that they get answered and we get through all of them. So with that in mind, let's kick things off. And Gabe, I kind of touched on your background, but just to give everyone maybe some more context for why you have such a passion for Bitcoin and why you've dedicated so much of your time and energy to this space, can you share the story of how you got involved in Bitcoin and why you decided to, make it such an important, part of your work?
Yeah, for sure. So I started following politics in 2007 when a gentleman from Texas called Ron Paul started talking about monetary policy and all the things that were wrong with our current monetary policy and foreign policy and other issues. But it really perked my interest on what was happening there. Obviously, little did we know, shortly after that, we had the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009, and near complete collapse of the financial system, to which, there was huge bailouts for banks and lots of consolidation in the private financial industries in lieu of that. So that really got my interest in finance in general. Before that, I had no idea how any of the system worked, or had no clue about finance. I didn't invest in anything. So that really got me to start thinking about, what is all this? Like, how could we come to a brink of collapse? And like we did. And at the time I was working for a land surveyor, building residential homes, and we were slammed busy before that. New houses going up constantly, and I was like working overtime, time and a half, because we were so busy, and then it just dropped off a cliff. So I saw the impact it had on the housing market firsthand. So I just started digging in, like what happened here. So fast forward, obviously Ron Paul being kind of libertarian, not kind of, very much,
No kind of about
the
it.
libertarian of our days. You know, it really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of the things wrong with the current system, and how our monetary system actually functioned and worked, kind of worked. So after that, and he also ran again in 2012. And that's when you know, Bitcoin had been born out of the financial crisis. And so during his second run, in all these libertarian circles, and that's where Bitcoin was really starting to get some initial traction and being talked about a lot. So that's where it crossed my path, and my new interest in finance. With my old interests, I had always been interested in technology. I was building gaming computers, PCs as a teenager myself. So I had always been interested. I went to college for computer engineering. So my interest in technology and new interest in finance kind of collided with Bitcoin, and I kind of immediately saw how interesting it was. To me, it was just fascinating. It was a fascinating technology, and a fascinating prospect that if we could redevelop a new monetary unit of account and store of value, what would that look like in the digital age? And so I kind of started diving down the rabbit hole to learning more about how this technology worked, if it could, you know, if it had any staying power. At that time, it had only been alive for, you know, a couple of years.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of questions on whether or not this would last at all.
So it's kind of this intersection of technology and interest in, you know, politics and how it affects monetary policy and the economy, and you know, how money is handled, and a lot of like a lot of factors at play, which is, I think, one of the fascinating things about Bitcoin. It's not just like a product, but it represents a lot of different things for many different people. And it's great to hear like that kind of organic interest from you very, very early on. So we could probably take this whole time and talk about like all the things that have happened with Bitcoin over, you know, the last decade or so, but we want to today, at least, we want to do a recap on 2022.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us, what are some of the kind of like salient points, some of the milestones that happened over the last 12 months in the Bitcoin space?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot. This year has been a very interesting year, to say the least. But specifically with Bitcoin, right, it was about this time last year that the latest kind of major update or upgrade in Bitcoin happened, and that was with Taproot. Taproot enabled new functionalities, new capabilities on Bitcoin that had been talked about for years, of course, and this has been building for years, but it was finally integrated into the protocol. So that has kind of for this whole year, that's kind of kicked off this whole new wave of innovation, building on Bitcoin and on layer twos, such as Lightning Network and other sidechains. The new capabilities that Bitcoin has now, without increasing any overhead as far as block size goes, and block space as it's used in the Bitcoin blockchain, is that we have more capabilities and functionality, increased functionality, without increasing the costs, without increasing the size of a transaction, and we can create infinitely more complex transactions now. So that is really exciting to see, these scaling capabilities that are now on Bitcoin, that are just now kind of coming to fruition, starting to be built and starting to come to light. So Lightning Network has just exploded with interest and development. Of course, we saw that as well at the beginning of this year. So we dove right in. And I had always been interested in Lightning Network since the paper was released in like 2017. But it's just taken so long to get it developed to a point where it's usable in any kind of real sense. With Taproot's integration into Bitcoin, that really kind of unleashed Lightning's kind of true potential, I feel like. So
real quick, just for someone who's not technical and hasn't read some of the documentation on Taproot, can you just walk us through what that development is? And like, you talked about some functionality it enables, but what are the specific things that unlocks?
Yeah, so it introduced a new kind of digital signature that is more compact. It doesn't take up as much transaction space. So it's more compact and more secure to boot. So there's just to put it very simply, that's kind of that in a nutshell. So it enables, when you don't take up as much space, there's only limited space on the blockchain or in a transaction output. So you have to kind of condense the functionality to fit within that confined space. With Taproot, it enabled that the functionality to increase while maintaining the same size transaction. So it's a really it's a technical feat that hasn't been done before, and it's really exciting to see how that is kind of playing out now, how that is being able to be utilized. And it's kind of opened up this like Pandora's box on exploring how far we can push the boundaries of that.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic in and of itself, like where Bitcoin can go. Because before this year, I'd never even considered the idea of like smart contracts being on Bitcoin, right? So, but now that's through Lightning Network. So where do you see Bitcoin functionality going over the next, let's say, year or so?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot of discussion and release of protocols that are happening right now. Probably one of the big ones is called Taro, which is being spearheaded by Lightning Labs. And what this does is basically enable complete Turing complete functionality on top of the Lightning Network. So any kind of tokens, any kind of automated DeFi, automated market makers, DeFi applications are now being explored on Lightning Network. And the benefit there is that the transaction cost and the speed is extremely fast. So again, we're able to take the security of the base layer of Bitcoin and without disrupting the consensus model either, building on top of that, right, on this second layer that doesn't require waiting for blocks and doesn't require confirmation times. It's instant settlement, lightning fast, and it's just crazy how the functionality of this is just opening up a whole host of possibilities. A lot of that which has been already explored in the Ethereum ecosystem and other ecosystems. We've seen how that has developed in those protocols. That capability is now kind of crossing over into Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just hearing you talk about some of those concepts, Turing complete, smart contracts, et cetera. Those are things, like you said, they've been talked about and executed on in the Ethereum space for a while now, but we haven't really seen those in Bitcoin. So let's think about 12 months from now for doing this podcast. How do you see, based on how you've seen Bitcoin evolving, what differences will remain and what similarities will remain between, say, Bitcoin and the Ethereum ecosystem at that point? Do you have any thoughts on how that's going to shape out?
Yeah, I think we'll start to see just a lot of parallels, a lot of, even with DeFi apps on Ethereum, they've been kind of crossing over into other ecosystems because Ethereum's too expensive. Ethereum hasn't solved their scalability issues. They decided to focus on swapping out their consensus mechanism instead. So it's a choice in how those ecosystems have been directed or are directing themselves, and what their value sets are. Bitcoin chose to, the Bitcoin ecosystem has chose to focus on scalability from the ground up while not compromising on the security and decentralization of the core protocol. So that, I think, has been basically the key differentiator between Bitcoin and everything else. So now that those things are in place on Bitcoin, we'll start to see the scalability and adoption of those kinds of applications on the Lightning Network and other layer 2s on Bitcoin, because it can scale. The scalability issue has basically been solved. There's still a lot of optimization to be done, of course, work to be done on that. But for the most part, the big chunks of where that friction lies, and what we felt in 2017 when transactions on Bitcoin were like 50 to $100 a pop, that's gone. That's never coming back. So we can be confident in building on Bitcoin now like never before. So that's basically, I think we'll start to see a lot of that innovation happen, and specifically how Lightning works, how it operates as a protocol. There's interesting dynamics there at play that's not quite like anything else in other DeFi ecosystems, because you have to build trustless environments for the most part. And there's, with the added functionality, there's other mechanisms to where different kinds of business models are going to be at play with Lightning, such as providing liquidity is going to be a huge industry, I feel like, on Lightning. So that's already starting to play out. We're starting to see a lot of entrance into that market space. So that's cool to see.
And on the topic of trust and where Bitcoin's going, bringing it back to 2022 with recent events, right, with FTX, and now there's some unconfirmed drama with Binance. That situation's hairy. I would just recommend anyone just go look it up. But with that, do you think all of this, even if the worst case scenario is true with Binance, do you think that's going to hurt Bitcoin in the short to midterm in terms of how people develop on it, or is it going to help? Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I don't think it really impacts the development of Bitcoin. Certainly, all this drama has been, in my mind, really kind of a positive, although it's been terrible for people who've lost money. Obviously, that should never happen. And the reason for this technology is specifically so that cannot happen.
Right.
And yet it's still happening because people are not utilizing this technology as it should be. So that's the big problem here. There's a big disconnect on what this is supposed to be and how it's being used today. And we're still relying on these centralized actors that are obviously either nefarious or just incompetent. So to handle like massive amounts of funds in the way that they do is just it's just proven time and time again that that's not the way that this should be. So I think having a more focused on building self-custodian solutions, making it super easy for users that are not super, techie or familiar with how any of this works, dumbing it down to where it's super easy for them to interact with this stuff and not rely on a centralized authority. You are communicating with a protocol through a dashboard, and you just point and click, and then the things happen. But what's making it happen in the background isn't a company, it's a protocol, and you're relying on that protocol to operate how the protocol is built, and that is backstopped by who builds it and who tests it and who's running on it, and so the trust in these third-party entities has to go away, and that's always been kind of like the purpose. But I think, unfortunately, humans, we have to learn the hard way sometimes, and we have to experience the pain to really see the value in having something like DeFi applications, DeFi exchanges, self-custody wallets, and why those are important, and why it takes worth knowing, right? Taking the time to learn these things and learn about them and how to use them is worth it.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up, Gabe, because when I think back over like a lot of the marketing that I've observed the last year, and I didn't really think about this until I just heard you say this, but I haven't heard a lot of voices advocating for non-custodial. I know they're there, but like anything that's got like a paid marketing budget behind it, almost everything I'm seeing, it's not the conversation. And a lot of the marketing, it's come from exchanges, right or wrong, but they're focusing on different aspects of blockchain and Bitcoin and Web3.
Sure.
And so what's your take? Is there like a conflict of interest between like an exchange not wanting people to be self-custodial? Is that the wrong perspective to take? Why aren't we hearing more people advocate for self-custody?
Yeah, that is a great question. And in this kind of like iteration of innovation, I would say, and if we just like take a step back and look at what has transpired with this industry over the last 13 years, almost 14 years since Bitcoin was first kind of dropped out of nowhere in our laps, it's been remarkable, needless to say. I could have not ever imagined in my wildest dreams, even a handful of years ago, that the space entirely would be where it's at right now, that Bitcoin's development would be where it's at right now, being adopted by all the major financial institutions and some countries as legal tender. That was just a wild dream just a handful of years ago. And to see how fast that has transpired has been remarkable, to say the least. So I would say that the initial iteration required decentralized controllers, because that's all who knew how to do anything with this stuff. So it's this tug and pull between the old and the new, right? It's this transition period that we're going through, and we're feeling, the growing pains of that with these exchanges going defunct and bankrupt, because they're not handling it properly. And if they can't handle it properly, and they're supposedly the trusted ones that know what they're doing, certainly the general public can't either. So it's really instructive to see how that's kind of emerged, right? Is that we're again just turning towards these centralized controllers, these third parties, and just trusting them. And what we have to do is change our mindset and change our behavior towards decentralization, self-custody, understanding what that means, and realizing not only the potential and promise, but why, right? Why is that important? And all of these failures that we're seeing in the market is just constantly just instilling that and reiterating that point to us, that it's very important and we should take it seriously, and we should act on it. We shouldn't just talk about it. We should build the things that are going to help people adopt this in a way that doesn't put their their life savings at risk. There's many news stories now about how people had their life savings in FTX, like a brand new company, only a couple years old, ran by this kid basically that knows nothing. It's insane that people do that, but they do, because they don't trust themselves. They'd rather trust somebody else that they perceive knows better. And that's gonna change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, fear of missing out, driving some of that as well. But Drew, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, it seems like almost from a customer perspective and from the perspective of most companies out there, not, I'm not going to like throw anyone or an industry like under the bus, but it's like self-custody, like non-custodial solutions in this space is hard. It's the hard way to do it. And so no one wants to do it. It's just an interest, it's just interesting overall. And it alludes to what Gabe was just saying. Like, yeah, it's just a weird, I guess it's not weird, right? But just the negative, the possible negative externalities of not having control and having another entity in control for you. That is just, that definitely has to change. I agree with Gabe 100%.
Yeah, just think about like how we've been taught to manage finances in basically every other aspect, right? Like we're told like, don't keep cash in your mattress, put it in the bank. It's much safer. There's a reason we don't have like bearer shares for stock anymore. Like you can think of plenty of other examples. The whole idea is someone else knows how to handle this better than you. So they're your custodian. And like that concept of like that actually being a bad thing or posing risks that, can't be mitigated. That's a new concept for people.
Yeah, it definitely is. And obviously we've never had this kind of thing before where we can own and control a digital asset, right? That's the new thing that is new to mankind. Like this is like a novel concept to grasp for everybody, right? So we're all learning in real time how to deal with a new kind of asset class that has never existed before in the history of humanity. So these growing pains are understandable to some degree, obviously, and we're still very, very early on in this. What I think is this convergence into the digital realm, if you will. And as we're moving more into the internet age, this is becoming more and more apparent that obviously it's not going away. It's actually very useful and needed for a lot of circumstances, and exploring those use cases and being able to properly manage how this develops and how how people interact with it is the new kind of frontier, right? This is what obviously us at BlockSpaces saw a handful of years ago and started embarking on. So that's what's exciting, really. That's what's exciting about diving into this, and that's why we see a lot of smart people coming into this space and building very interesting new kinds of products that weren't even possible before Bitcoin.
Yeah, new things get solved and then new problems emerge, or there's just this cycle of like new things that now can be built and need to be built, and maybe if they were built a few years ago it would have been too soon, and now the time's right. So
Exactly.
Yeah, just a quick reminder. So guys, we're about halfway through, and so if you've got questions for Gabe, drop them in the Q&A. We're going to keep going. Drew and I could talk with Gabe for probably the rest of the day about this stuff. But yeah, just a reminder, any questions you have, put them in the Q&A and we'll get those answered. But Drew, I know you've been thinking a lot about just some of the geopolitical aspects of Bitcoin. You want to just kind of take us in that direction for a minute?
Yeah. Because I mean, FTX and all that stuff that happened is very recent. It's fresh in everyone's mind, but 2022 is still a pretty long year. In a lot of different ways, and not just with exchanges. And so I wanted to ask too, so like, where do you see a lot of other like geopolitical developments and how they would affect Bitcoin, like not just with Russia and Ukraine, but also with like a lot of leaps and bounds this year have been made on CBDCs and things like that. So how do you see like the global shifting of power in the world? How do you see that affecting Bitcoin, if at all?
Yeah, this is probably one of the most interesting, and one of the things that I saw early on that really kind of clicked with me or resonated with me while I was learning about Bitcoin in its early days, there was the event at Cyprus, Greece, where they did a bail-in, where they shut all the banks down, all the ATMs, restricted everybody access to everybody's accounts, and then took a haircut of 20% off of all of depositors across the board to bail themselves out of their financial crisis. And that was the first time Bitcoin shot over $100. And so when I saw Bitcoin reacting to those geopolitical events, that's when it dawned on me how big of a deal this was, that this was going to radically change how things operate in the future, and to the highest levels, to nation state levels. So I think this is where kind of like we're going to start to see a real shift in positioning on like what is a nation state's Bitcoin strategy. I think that's going to be a real conversation. If it's not already happening, it's kind of tangentially happening with CBDCs. That's kind of like in a backhanded way, discussing Bitcoin and the impact of Bitcoin, because they still want to, with CBDCs, obviously central banks still want to maintain that control and maintain that authority, where Bitcoin, completely releases that from their hands. So I think there's going to be a real tug and pull there, and I think we're already starting to see countries taking a position in some way, shape, or form on that. Of course, China banning mining through the whole country, where Bitcoin was predominantly mined in China before that. And then we just saw how Bitcoin's network just routed around China in a couple months. It was remarkable to see that happen. Did that happen this year? I think that happened this year. Was that this year? I don't know.
I think so. Was it early this year, late last year?
I think it happened this year. So that was remarkable. And now we're seeing Bitcoin's hash rate at all-time highs, or at least recently it was at all-time highs, which means the miners haven't stopped hashing. The Bitcoin network hasn't dropped a beat. It's continuing to pump out blocks every 10 minutes. So that has been also remarkable to see that how anti-fragile this network is, even from probably the largest nation state attack that you could possibly do on Bitcoin. And it had no effect. It had zero effect. So the network's stronger now than it was before, if anything. So that's the thing that you just have to contend with now. This is a fact that every nation on the planet has to contend with, and you're either going to go on the side of, how I see it is, you're either on the side of being with people having their independence and freedom, or more dictatorial, top-down, totalitarian kind of mind frame. And that's basically how China's going that route, and the US is still kind of deciding.
It's almost like shaping up to where like US and China are going to be like an A/B test of what the two possible scenarios are. Because I mean, we all heard Gensler over the past month basically cave on Bitcoin and just kind of give up. Like, we can't put almost his exact quote was like, we can't make this a security. There's no one to demand to sign papers. So it is what it is. So it's just like you said, the way you put that's interesting. The national Bitcoin policy, like what's your go-to strategy on Bitcoin as a nation? So is there anything you would like to see from like a US strategy on how to deal with Bitcoin, how to foster it, I guess?
How to foster it? Well, they can. So a couple things. There's a huge narrative now, especially coming from a ESG perspective, that's casting a negative light on Bitcoin mining. And I think that's a bad take. They're just looking at it from a surface level on Bitcoin's using energy, and that's bad. They don't go very much deeper into the notion of how Bitcoin is using energy, what kind of energy it's using, and how can it actually benefit power grids. And that's being explored now in other countries. Actually, Jack Dorsey just tweeted a series of tweets about some work that they're doing in Africa, in these villages, in the middle of nowhere, being able to harness hydroelectric energy from like a little stream, like a little river, and they're generating Bitcoin. They throw a couple Bitcoin miners into that makeshift hydro plant, and they're actually able to generate not only electricity but generate Bitcoin, which then goes back into their economy, which they can then utilize to grow their village, right? Put value back, and they couldn't do that without an offset cost for building that thing, right? These are very, very poor countries that don't have access to a power grid. Like, we have such a Western privileged mindset when we talk about these things, right? Because we could just flip on a switch on our wall and see how easy it is to get electricity. It's like, no, what has to go behind that is enormous and tremendously expensive. And it took us decades to get to where we are, right? And these countries still, there's many places around the world that don't have access to electricity like we do. And Bitcoin's actually an incentive to make that happen and to tap into energy resources that otherwise would not be feasible or cost effective from a power grid perspective. So this is actually changing. Another facet is the energy grid. I think again we'll see how nation states either adopt or choose to ban Bitcoin, and how that actually affects the energy grid on a global scale, because this stuff is global, right? A Bitcoin miner can basically live anywhere. We're seeing new devices now that you can put a Bitcoin miner on your water heater too, so it generates Bitcoin while it heats your water. So it's the scale of this can be very small in a household or very big. So the utilization of that from an energy grid cost savings or offsetting cost perspective is going to be huge, I think. And I think we see El Salvador also seeing that potential. That's definitely a use case that I keep close tabs on to see how they're developing as a country, by being like one of the first. They're like pioneering how a nation can move on a Bitcoin standard and be totally self-sustainable from a very poor country riddled with gangs and violence, to now they've like almost completely changed the dynamics of their internal economy within a year. I mean, they only adopted Bitcoin as legal tender maybe 18 months ago. So that's been, of course, Bitcoin's price is down since then, so that hasn't helped in that regard. But as far as how they're utilizing their energy resources in a way that they never have before, because there's an incentive to, that's been super fascinating.
Can you break that down a little further? Because one thing you'll find is, like, depending on who you ask, Bitcoin in El Salvador is going terribly wrong, or it's amazing, right?
Yeah. There's obviously, it depends on how you look at it. And again, like, this only happened 18 months ago. To think that everything would change on a dime is just not feasible, or kind of ludicrous thinking, right? This is going to take time. You can't enter the Bitcoin standard for a whole country and expect things to just magically shift overnight. But the fact that it's shifting in the right direction, right? The direction that they wanted to see their country go, is a positive sign that they are moving in the right direction. Things are developing in the way that they had hoped. And if you ask people there, they would say that it's going probably better than they originally thought. Now there's still a lot of work to be done. I know several people that have been there, that live there, and they they'll say there's a lot of there's an education gap, right? There's a lot of people that still don't quite get it, right? They don't understand why this is important. And again, that's understandable. This is a whole new paradigm, right? That you have to learn about. You have to understand why it's important. And even though President Bukele gets that, not necessarily the rest of his country does, right? There's a division there, just like there would be in any political regime, right? You have supporters and you have haters of whatever that other party supports. So it's the same kind of human dynamic there as anywhere else. But for the most part, I think it's really a positive thing that they're doing, and I think we'll start to see the fruits of what they've kind of laid the foundation for over the next handful of years.
Yeah, we should probably do a follow-up conversation maybe sometime next year to dive into that further, because there's a lot to unpack there. But Dana, I think we've had a few questions come through. Do you want to queue those up so we can allocate some time to those?
Yeah, absolutely. So we got several questions from Richard, but I want to start off with this one because it kind of piggybacks off of our conversation about energy a bit. Richard asks, any opinions on the recent announcement of nuclear fusion and its potential on removing a negative of Bitcoin mining?
Fusion, yeah, that's been a very interesting topic as of late. Again, exploring these new energy resources, new ways of developing energy. I think it's going to make a huge impact, obviously not only for mankind. Any negative effect on Bitcoin, I can't think of a negative effect. Anything that makes energy cheaper and taps into renewable energy sources, Bitcoin is the king at that. Bitcoin, if you took Bitcoin as an industry in and of itself, it is the single best use of renewable energies right now on the planet. There's no other industry that's using renewable energy more than Bitcoin. So if you're for renewable energies, you should be for Bitcoin, because it is giving a perfect use case for renewable energies in a way that no other industry has been able to demonstrate so far. So if we could tap into fusion energy, nuclear fusion, that would be amazing. And it would just help increase security for the network.
Great. The next question from Richard as well. He wants to know, what incentives are there for mining when we get closer to all 21 million coins that are available?
Yeah, this is a common question, because right now the incentive is built into the block reward. So there's a subsidy of Bitcoin that's being generated every 10 minutes. For every block that's created, that goes to the miners. But also the miners also get all the transactions that happen are contained within that block, all the transaction fees, that is. So the idea is that once Bitcoin becomes more and more used, and there's limited block space in each block, so the value of that block space is going to go up, and so transaction fees are going to increase, and you're going to start to see more activity flow to the Lightning Network because transaction fees are much less there, and also the settlement times are instant. So you're going to see on-chain transactions be designated for high value transactions. And basically all the lower transactability day-to-day spending is going to be on the Lightning Network, which totally makes sense because you don't want to wait to settle every single transaction every single time. So the transactability will flow to the Lightning Network while you maintain the security needs of the base chain. So I think the incentive will be, well, I think there's a couple interesting things here. The incentive for mining will still be applicable. I mean, there's going to be a block subsidy for the next at least 120 years. So I think thinking about this now is a little bit premature, but because right now, effectively, it's under 2%, I believe. The block subsidy is 6.25 Bitcoin per block. So in the next halving in 2 years, or I think a year and a half at this point, that's going to be cut in half again. So 3.125 Bitcoin per block is going to be the subsidy. So depending on the price of Bitcoin, you know, that could be either substantial or not so much. So you're going to shore up your revenue as a miner, potentially in some other way. And I think providing that liquidity to the Lightning Network is actually going to be an additional revenue source for miners because they are the ones with the most liquidity, the quickest, in terms of Bitcoin liquidity, and they can start offsetting that that block subsidy by generating yield through the Lightning Network and providing liquidity needs there. So I think that's really going to be the model going forward is miners are going to start shifting that liquidity need and actually using Bitcoin in that sense to generate yield.
Very interesting. That's a great question. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
Our next question is, we're kind of looking ahead into the new year. It's from Ted, and he wants to know, is there a glaring single headwind or a grouping of headwinds that Bitcoin faces in 2023?
The biggest glaring headwind I see is regulatory. With this fallout with FTX and several other bankruptcies that has happened, transpired in the latter half of this year. You know, there's a lot of attention, obviously, towards regulation. And I think that's a problem. I think we were better suited when the regulators kind of just like brushed this off as a little hobbyist thing that, you know, wasn't really transacting a whole lot of dollars or putting a lot of people at risk. But that's not where we are anymore. So those discussions are going to be increasingly important to pay attention to. And really there's a lot of industry folks that are trying to, you know, talk to the regulators and help them understand, like, look, don't overreact about this because this is important and this could affect how, like we mentioned earlier, the geopolitical strategy. If we end up, you know, having a heavy hand like China, that could be extremely detrimental in the future. So we don't want to move quick in regards to regulations, especially. I mean, I was listening to the hearing, the FTX hearing yesterday, and yeah, these congressmen, they have zero clue what they're talking about. Let's be honest.
Yeah, one of them made a comment of like he still thought crypto was basically for terrorists who want to hide their money, right? And that's such an antiquated view of things.
It's not only antiquated, it's just false.
It's wrong.
It's like
hide your money on a public blockchain.
we run chain analytics on this constantly, and you know, the vast majority of illegal activity is not happening in Bitcoin. It's happening with the US dollar in traditional banks. That's why banks have been fined in more in value than the whole worth of the whole crypto market. So this is a ridiculous claim that they're making, but they're just saying this stuff, and like nobody's checking them on it, and it's blatantly false, patently false, and it could be provably false if they would look into the information. Of course they don't. So that is a huge risk as far as the US is concerned, in the headwinds going forward. That I think I actually don't know if it will impact Bitcoin as much as the rest of the alt market, because Gensler has been very clear that, hey, Bitcoin's a commodity. It's not a security, and that has been now declared numerous times. So I think it's becoming more and more clear in the growing confidence that Bitcoin's not going to be the thing that is regulated as a security, but it could be regulated as a commodity, and it probably will. I mean, the IRS already does, right? If you pay your taxes from Bitcoin transactions, you're paying the capital gains and losses. So that's already established. So that's nothing new. And we know how to deal with that. So hopefully that doesn't change further, and they don't add more extraneous restrictions on this industry, just because, right? Because they have to justify their existence and make it seem like they're doing something useful when they're actually not. So we'll see. I have my hopes that we have a lot of support as well, even in Congress. There's a blockchain council in Congress now, and we have champions like Tom Emmer and Loomis from Wyoming that is really trying to set up guardrails within Congress that they should treat this stuff appropriately, but that still takes a lot of education and understanding to get it right.
Great. I think we've got time for one last question. Let me double check. So this one is definitely, I've seen a lot of headlines about this, so I'm interested in your answer, Gabe. But Richard asked, what impact do lost coins have on the entire landscape?
Yeah, it's always interesting to question the lost coins, and I mean I've lost keys to coins, so you're welcome. If you own Bitcoin, I essentially what that does is it just it basically gives back to everybody else that owns Bitcoin, right? Because you're effectively, if you lost coins, what that means is that you have lost your private keys to be able to spend those Bitcoins, which means that they're locked in there forever and they're never moving. This is what I think. Satoshi's coins are locked forever. They're never going anywhere. I think Satoshi, whoever he, she, them, they are, I think they've passed away. I don't think anybody has access to those keys, and so I don't think those coins are ever moving. And it's impossible to know which coins are actually lost. There's only rough guesstimates. That's the best you can do, because we're seeing continually, we'll see news articles that are tracking old wallets, and we're seeing constantly where wallets that are 10, 12 years old, where coins that were minted in the early days of Bitcoin have just now moved for the first time ever. So where we might have thought those were lost before, right? Because we assume that somebody lost those keys because they haven't moved, but now they're moving. So it's impossible to know whether or not coins are actually lost. So it's hard to gauge, but essentially that all that does is give back. That's why you got to manage your keys.
And we actually did get one last question in, so we're going to try and squeeze this in really quick. This is from Michael, And he says, my question is about timing. There is a saying that pioneers are the ones to face the most resistance when exploring new areas. His question is, do you still encounter this phenomenon when talking about what blockchains can do for traditional businesses? And if so, do you always face the same kind of resistance, or is it different from client to client? Great question, Michael.
Great question. Yeah, it varies. Like everybody's it comes at this from a different perspective, right? So it depends on the business owner perspective, the business objectives as well, and what the pain points are, right? Bitcoin should solve a problem. And I think the problem, mainly right now for businesses is transaction fees are extremely high going through payment processors and whatnot. So I think what you, as a business owner, if you want to see yourself moving into the future, right? See yourself where your business is going to be in 5-10 years. Is it going to be adopting Bitcoin or still questioning it? Of course, companies that we talked to, 10 years ago to start adopting Bitcoin, they have mixed feelings about it because they didn't know where this was going to go. They cashed out early. Had they kept them, they would have made out really well. But it all depends on the business and the business objectives and what the strategy there is. And we definitely want to make it super easy to lower that barrier of questioning completely, and just say yes and see how it goes.
Yeah, good question, Michael. And next year will be really, well, every year's been interesting, right? But next year we're going to see, I think that's going to be a topic that stays top of mind for a lot of people is, now like it's never been in the news more, I think, than it has now. And it's on more people's radar and the world's changing very quickly. So we'll see what kind of problems it can solve and what kind of resistance or interest people have in using it. So, all right. Well, that's about all the time we have, Gabe. It was awesome chatting with you today. Man, great insights. Really, really appreciate you being here. If someone wants to get in touch with you after this, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, they can reach out on Twitter. It's probably a good way. Just look me up, Gabe B for Bitcoin Higgins. That's my handle. Just ping me there. My DMs are open, I think, except for scammers.
Okay. If you're a scammer, don't ping Gabe, but everyone else, you're good to go. All right, cool. Well, if you've got a moment to share some feedback, Dana, I think you dropped that. Yeah, you just dropped that link to the survey in there. So if you have a moment to take that, I think it just takes about a minute, just like 4 or 5 questions. That's really helpful for us because it helps us understand, should we change the format around? What kind of topics would you like to see? What can we be doing better to make these experiences better for you? Because this is why we're doing it. This is for you all. This is to help you learn, help build a sense of community. And so anything you can tell us to help us improve is always very welcome. So thanks in advance for taking that. And just as a heads up, in a couple of weeks, we're going to do our next live interview in AMA. It's going to be with Alex from our team. We're going to talk about how Bitcoin fits into the broader Web3 ecosystem. So it'll be a nice kind of continuation of this thread. So be on the lookout for an invite for that. But until then, thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here. Enjoy your day, and we will see you next time.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.